I want you to picture a wedding dress hanging in a garment bag in a guest room closet. 3 days before the wedding, exactly where it's supposed to be. And then picture that closet, 2 days later, completely empty. No note. No explanation. Just an empty hanger swinging where 80 hours of alterations used to hang. That's how this story starts. Not with shouting. With an empty hanger. My name doesn't matter. What matters is who took the dress, why she thought she'd get away with it, and what she didn't know about the woman she was about to make an enemy of. Stick around. This one gets cold before it gets satisfying. Welcome back to Blood and Backbone, where we talk about the moments families don't put in the holiday newsletter. If you're new here, these stories are dramatized for entertainment, but the kind of betrayal you're about to hear, that part's real for a lot of people. If it's real for you too, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. Let's call her Renee. 31 years old, a museum conservator by trade, which meant she spent her professional life handling fragile, irreplaceable things with white gloves and a steady hand. It was a strange kind of foreshadowing, considering what was about to happen to the most fragile, irreplaceable thing she owned personally. Renee's wedding dress wasn't bought off a rack. It had belonged to her grandmother first, a simple ivory silk gown from 1964, kept in a cedar box for decades, brought out exactly twice, once for Renee's mother's wedding, and once, finally, for Renee's. When Renee's mother passed away 3 years before the engagement, the dress became something closer to a relic than a garment. Renee had it carefully restored by a textile specialist, a process that took 4 months and cost more than the venue deposit. She wasn't being sentimental for the sake of sentimentality. She was the last woman in her family who could wear it. After her, there was no one left to pass it to, unless she had a daughter of her own someday. The man Renee was marrying was named Patrick, an easygoing architect with a close relationship to his mother, a woman named Carol. Carol had opinions. Carol had always had opinions, about Patrick's first girlfriend in college, about the apartment he rented after graduation, about the route he should take to work to avoid traffic. Patrick had spent 34 years learning to nod, agree, and quietly do whatever he wanted anyway. It was a system that worked fine for him. It worked considerably less fine for the people who married into it. From the engagement party onward, Carol made her position about the wedding clear in dozens of small ways. She suggested a different venue, twice, after the deposit was already paid. She mentioned, more than once, that Patrick's college girlfriend would have looked stunning in a modern silhouette, the implication being that an antique restored dress was somehow a downgrade. And at the final dress fitting, the one where Renee invited Carol specifically as a gesture of goodwill, Carol stood in the doorway, looked at the gown for a long moment, and said, "It's very vintage, isn't it? Brave choice for photos that'll last forever." Renee let it go. She told herself Carol just had a difficult relationship with change, that this was the kind of comment mothers-in-law made out of nerves rather than malice, that it would pass once the wedding actually happened and Carol could see her son was happy. She was wrong on every count. 3 days before the wedding, Renee brought the dress to Patrick's childhood home, where the ceremony was being held in the backyard, a sentimental choice Patrick had pushed for. She hung it in the closet of the guest room where she'd be getting ready, zipped safely into a breathable garment bag, exactly the way her textile specialist had instructed. She checked on it once that evening. It was there. 2 days later, the morning of the rehearsal, she went to check on it again, and the closet was empty. Not moved. Not misplaced. Empty. The hanger still swinging slightly like it had only just been disturbed. Renee's first instinct wasn't panic, it was confusion, the kind where your brain refuses to accept the most obvious explanation because the obvious explanation is too absurd to be real. She searched the room. She searched the hall closet. She asked Patrick, who looked as baffled as she felt. And then she found Carol in the kitchen, calmly drinking coffee, and asked if she'd seen anyone go into the guest room. Carol's answer came out smooth, almost rehearsed. "Oh, I had it sent out for a proper cleaning. It looked a little dusty for the big day. I know a wonderful woman who does this sort of thing." There was no wonderful woman. There was no receipt, no business card, no phone number Carol could produce when Renee asked, gently at first, then with rising urgency, for the name of this dry cleaner. Carol kept finding new versions of the same vague answer. She'd misplaced the card. She'd call later. She was sure it would all be sorted out by tomorrow. Patrick, to his credit, did not let it go the way he usually did. He pressed his mother directly, in front of Renee, voice tight in a way Renee had never heard from him before. "Mom, where is the dress?" And that's when Carol finally said the thing she'd clearly been holding back since the doorway comment at the fitting. "I just thought, with everything else going on, maybe it was a sign to simplify things. That dress was 80 years old, Renee. I had Linda's daughter's old gown steamed and ready in the hall closet. The one from her wedding 2 years ago. It's lovely. Modern. I think you'll actually prefer it once you see it." The room went very still. Renee did not raise her voice. She has told people since that this was the moment she became aware of exactly how angry she was, because her hands had gone completely steady, the way they did at work when she was handling something irreplaceable and could not afford to shake. "Where is my grandmother's dress, Carol? I gave it to a thrift collector downtown. I'm sure she'll find someone who appreciates it." Renee did not scream. She did not cry, not yet. She drove, alone, to the thrift shop Carol vaguely named, arriving 20 minutes before closing, and described the dress to a clerk who recognized it immediately. Because, as it turned out, an 80-year-old restored silk wedding gown is not a common donation, and the clerk had already set it aside in the back, suspecting correctly that someone had made a serious mistake. Renee got the dress back, undamaged, 2 days before her wedding, by the thinnest possible margin of luck and a clerk with good instincts. She wore it. The wedding happened. Photos were taken. From the outside, the story might have looked finished right there. Dress recovered, day saved, happily ever after intact. But something had shifted permanently the moment Carol said the words, "I thought it was a sign to simplify things," and Renee spent the rest of that wedding day smiling in photographs while quietly, privately, deciding that this would not be forgotten, only postponed. The years that followed looked, on the surface, completely normal. Renee was polite to Carol at holidays. She sent thoughtful gifts on her birthday. She never once brought up the dress again, not at Thanksgiving, not at the family reunions, not even during the rare arguments she and Patrick had about his mother's habit of overstepping. Patrick noticed the change in his wife regardless. Not coldness exactly, something more precise than that, a kind of careful, permanent distance that no amount of time seemed to soften. He asked her about it once, a year or so into the marriage. "Do you think you'll ever really forgive her for the dress thing?" Renee considered the question honestly before answering. "I forgave her for taking it. I'm having a harder time forgiving her for what she said while she was doing it. She didn't think it was a mistake. She thought it was a favor." 5 years passed. Patrick's father, a quiet, kind man named Walter who had largely stayed out of his wife's stronger opinions over the decades, passed away somewhat suddenly. In the aftermath, the family discovered that Walter had, years earlier, set up a modest trust meant to be split between Patrick and his sister, with a clause naming each spouse as a co-trustee, a fairly standard legal structure meant to keep the money protected and properly managed rather than handed over all at once. Carol, as it turned out, had no direct control over this trust at all. Walter had specifically structured it that way, a detail that surprised exactly no one who'd watched Carol's spending habits over the years. The co-trustees were Patrick, his sister, and, due to a clause Walter had added without much discussion at the time, the spouses of both children, meaning Renee held a legal vote in how distributions from that trust were handled going forward, specifically regarding requests for early or discretionary withdrawals beyond the standard scheduled payments. Carol, it turned out, had been counting on access to those funds. Not as a thief exactly, more as someone who had simply assumed, the way she'd assumed most things in her life, that family money existed primarily to solve Carol's problems when Carol decided she had one. 6 months after Walter's death, Carol requested a significant discretionary withdrawal from the trust, citing renovations to the family home that, as Patrick's sister quietly confirmed, were largely cosmetic and not remotely urgent. The request came to a vote among the trustees. Patrick, uncomfortable but unwilling to simply rubber stamp something his father likely wouldn't have approved either, abstained, which under the trust's terms effectively required unanimous trustee agreement to pass. His sister, who had her own complicated history with Carol's habit of treating other people's resources as flexible, voted no. That left Renee's vote as, functionally, the deciding factor. She did not vote out of spite, and anyone who tells this story as a simple even trade, a dress for an inheritance, is flattening something more complicated than that. Renee genuinely reviewed the renovation request, genuinely considered whether it served Walter's intent for the trust, and genuinely concluded, on the actual merits, that it did not. But she has also admitted, since, that the decision was easier to make cleanly, without guilt, without the usual pull toward keeping the peace, because some version of her had stopped extending Carol the benefit of the doubt 5 years earlier, in a guest room, in front of an empty hangar. She voted no. The withdrawal was denied. Carol called Renee directly, furious, demanding to know why family was suddenly so quick to deny family something reasonable. Renee's answer, by every account from people who were in the house that day, was calm, brief, and almost gentle in its delivery. I considered the request on its merits, Carol. The renovations aren't urgent, and the trust exists for things that are. I'm sorry you're upset, but I'm not going to approve spending that doesn't serve what Walter actually intended. There was a long pause on the line. And then Carol said something that, according to Patrick, who was standing close enough to hear both sides of the call, made the entire history of the last 5 years click suddenly and uncomfortably into place for him. This is about that ridiculous dress, isn't it? No, Renee said. This is about whether I trust your judgment with things that matter to other people. You answered that question for me a long time ago. The trust stayed intact. Carol's renovations got postponed indefinitely, eventually scaled down to something far smaller and self-funded. And the family settled into a new, quieter equilibrium, one where Carol, for the first time in Patrick's entire life, had genuinely learned that there were rooms in this family she no longer had the keys to. Renee still sees her mother-in-law at holidays. They are civil. They are, in their own careful way, even kind to each other, in the manner of two people who have arrived at a clear, mutual understanding of where the boundaries actually are. Renee never brought up the dress to Carol again, not once, not even during the trust dispute, because she didn't need to. She had simply stopped being a person Carol could move through without consequence, and that turned out to matter far more, in the end, than any single conversation about silk and cedar boxes ever could have. Here's what stays with me about this one. Renee never delivered a single speech about the dress. She never demanded an apology, never brought it up at dinner to score a point, never even raised her voice the day she found out what Carol had done. She just quietly, permanently, recalibrated how much trust she extended to someone who had shown her, plainly, what she did with things that weren't hers to decide about. Sometimes the real consequence isn't the blow-up. It's the slow, patient withdrawal of goodwill from someone who never even noticed it was the only thing protecting them. If this story hit close to home for you, I'd genuinely like to know. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done in Renee's position. And if you want more stories like this one, I've got a new one coming this week. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next story.